This is lecture 13 in International Human Rights. I want in this lecture not specifically to look at the philosophy of rights, the legal documents, declarations, covenants, protocols, many documents that particularly come out of the United Nations or states themselves, charters of rights, that deal with human rights, or the organizations, either statist or non-statist, that deal with rights. I want to look briefly, I'm going to call this lecture Comedic, Tragic, and Human Rights. Some of the larger life issues itself that always stand back of and inform human rights, and in which, regardless of all the planning that humans can do, all the shaping, all the making, all their organizations, all their institutions, that are, at least in principle, in a conflictual way meant to deal with rights, are only in a limited way able to do that, and imperfectly so. And as long as people realize that all human planning, all human organization, all attempts to fix problems, to solve human rights violations are at best always limited in what they can do, because there are much greater forces at work in the world beyond human organization, planning, fix-it solutions, technical abilities to sort things out. And in the journey of human rights, it's always important to set the longing and the legitimate hopes and dreams of human rights within a much larger life context itself, of which there is this clash, inevitably so, and has been reflected upon meaningfully and substantively through all civilizations throughout time, in terms of the comedic and the tragic in the human life journey, both between humans and nature itself. And so it is these two elements of life itself, the tensions between humans in communities, between states throughout history and very much with us today, and then between nature and humanity itself, in which the tragic and the comedic plays itself out again and again, like a drama that ever recycles itself, like a great Greek drama, a great Shakespearean drama, or Goethe or Marlowe, any of the great writers. Great stories of India, the Mahabharata or the Ramayana, or Lao Tzu or Confucius, many First Nation stories and their legends and myths. They're always working through these key elements, often of the ambiguities, the mysteries, the uncertainties of life itself, that humanity, as much as it would like, cannot control, shape, form. And when humans attempt to do that, they only do that in a limited and imperfect way. But to the comedic and the tragic. When we hear the word comedic at a superficial and obviously popular level, people think comedy as laughter and humor. Milton would say laughter holding both its sides. That's not what comedy means in the more sophisticated and meaningful cultural sense. Comedy, historically, within philosophy, within literature, within religion, within larger cultural issues, takes the position that, in fact, the human in life journey is one fraught again and again with challenges, with difficulties. Both humans attempting to find who they are, how they're to live their life meaningfully and in some sort of a thoughtful way, individually, the relationship of individuals to families, to communities, to other peoples who are not like them, different ethnic peoples. And so these various layers, both internal journey and external journey, inevitably challenges will come the way of one and all. And in the process, some of those challenges are more painful, they're more difficult to face into given people's histories, but inevitably, what Martin Heidegger says, people live in a state of thrown-ness. We are thrown into a body, into a language, into a culture, into a people. None of us asked for that. That's just our thrown-ness. It's then, what do we do with our thrown-ness? Because people cannot choose their thrown-ness. It's what they do with their thrown-ness. And some people's thrown-ness is much more painful and sad than others. But thrownness is nonetheless a real factor of the human journey. Now, inevitably, with thrownness comes the issue whether it's a painful thrownness, whether it's a thrownness in which there's a little more peace and security, or whether it's an affluent thrownness, it's nonetheless. Each and all eventually have to face challenges and difficulties on their journey. They can be inner issues in which they have to face both the things they aspire to in life and the difficulty in achieving what they aspire to in life, the roadblocks, their insecurities, their fears, their doubts. Uh, and some people become crippled and paralyzed by those. Others see them as challenges internally to be overcome. But within the comedic approach to life, there is this notion that, in fact, each and all will, inevitably and necessarily so, have to face into the winds, the storms, the struggles, the disappointments, the betrayals of life. That is a given within all great classical thought, whether Western or Eastern or otherwise. It's the question is do people fold their hands and give up? The struggles are too difficult, the winds too strong, the tempest too difficult, and then they begin to either blame their past on what has happened or just feel that they're not up to sailing the ship through the storms of time in a difficult way. Others come up to those challenges, and it's not like it occurs just once in life. Life is one ongoing challenge after another, sometimes more intense at one period of time than another itself. Those challenges can come from interpersonal relationships. They can come from communities in conflict. They can come from communities in conflict with other communities. They can come from communities within a state, and these conflicts emerge. So these challenges are what the Greeks call the agon or the agonistes. Then there's also, of course, the challenge of nature itself. So humanity has agon struggles as they attempt to live together. But then nature brings certain illnesses and diseases. Weather systems can bring tornadoes and floods. We're living through COVID crisis at the present time. This is nature and humans in agon, struggling attempt to find some sort of a meaningful ending and working through this, and the difficulties of doing that, particularly the states which have been the most affected by COVID and the deaths which have occurred, or those who have not died, having to live with the long-term implications of COVID. This is nature and humans in contest. And COVID is just one amongst many areas in which both weather itself or diseases, they can be cancer, people coming to the end of their life with various forms of dementia. These are, again, agons and the impact of that on family and siblings. This is, and of course, human rights are all a part of this, but one can't say because one has legal documents that it's going to forbid cancer or prevent COVID or nature itself with its floods and storms and global warming. These are issues that to some degree we have created, we try and solve, but the implications of it continue to be real. But within a comedic outlook, the belief is that through coming up to the challenges individually, communally, state-wise, or the international order itself through the UN or regional powers, that a good will come at their best, some sort of a meaningful, happy ending, which of course we know is naive in any significant sense. But within the comedic outlook, that is that there are these challenges. They will continue to be part of the human journey, and when a person somehow thinks they won't occur, then they are simply being naive and silly, because life again and again is fraught with one challenge after another. But particularly great works of literature like Dante's Divine Comedy, or when one watches, for example, many movies that have the happy ending, there is the struggle, there is the challenge that is a part of it. But comedic movies, as in comedic works of art and literature, there's the happy the happy ending. So one looks at the Harry Potter, there is the challenge again and again, as each of the books or the films are saying, but at the end, Voldemort is ended. A short period of time, evil is banished. Lord of the Rings, once again, you go through all three books, or The Hobbit. Uh, Star Wars, again, once you see evil is eventually overthrown and good ends. So it's the traditional comedic ending in which, through struggle, through labor, through difficulty, through internally facing one's own challenges, and then externally dealing with, the good will emerge. And so, within the language of human rights and the optimistic approach which emerged from the language philosophically of rights, legal documents of rights, being embedded at the UN and other states' legal constitutions and structures, there is the belief that, in fact, we will move forward. Will be a comedic ending. There is struggle, of course, but the good is increasingly so, spreading out like light across the landscape towards the end. That's the comedic approach to rights through human effort, and there obviously is much good in that understanding, and it cannot be denied. But there are also these many challenges to a comedic understanding of the agon and the good, which is the logical conclusion. The other approach, which is as old in its understanding of the human journey as is the comedic, is the tragic understanding. That can go back to the Greeks, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, their argument to some degree, where there was a sad ending, as much as humans have tried to live a meaningful life. The result was because of a tragic flaw in some of the leading figures. So, for example, in Antigone, the reason Antigone is finally killed by Creon is her intransigent moral vision that would brook no compromises with Creon, who was the head of the state. And it was this inability to compromise. In each of Aeschylus's, Euripides, Sophocles' plays, you find the same thing, of course, in Shakespeare's tragedies, Macbeth or Hamlet, whose Hamlet is perpetually paralyzed by his weighing various options. He knows what he must do, but he's always finding excuses not to do what he must do in terms of dealing with his father's murder. And the man who did it, of course, married his mother. But the tragic one element of the Greek Shakespearean, and there are other versions of this as well, is that to some degree people suffer tragically, not because of the slings and arrows of others, but because of a tragic flaw, a weakness within them in which they're not willing to face into, and eventually they become the victims of their own weakness. They are undealt with shadow. And so one element of understanding the tragic is the whole element of human weakness and people not willing to deal with their own limitations or their dark side, which they repress, they deny, or they indulge. And then there, of course, are implications of indulging one's shadow, darker side in that sense. But that doesn't answer meaningfully the larger questions of the tragic, because there are many people who have suffered in life, and it is not because of any tragic flaw, any undealt with weakness, any indulging narcissistic desires or bloated appetites, and then having to live with the consequences of that. There are innocent people who suffer. So some of the great works of literature, particularly emerging in the last few hundred years, whether it's writers like Thomas Hardy's Tess of the D'Urbervilles or Jude the Obscure, whether it's Robinson Jeffers, one of the great poets of California. I've been fortunate to spend some lovely time at Jeffers' home, and some of his great writings on the tragic. He, and of course he knew the Greek tragedians very, very well. He knew his Shakespeare inside and out. But people like, for example, Hardy, Tess and the D'Urbervilles, or Jude the Obscure, these are people who are born into unfortunate situations. There was no tragic flaw. They made no choices. Lower class families. And again, they're marginalized, they're rejected, they're mistreated within their society, as much as they try to overcome the agons of their time, try to face into the challenges. And as I said, traditionally, within a comedic tradition, they do overcome them and the ending is happy. But within the great literature of the tragic, um, you get this notion of women and men and children it having nothing to do, in fact, with tragic flaws or weaknesses, but in fact, the slings and arrows of nature. So some children born into famines, born into flood, born into situations in life, they did nothing wrong. They are not responsible for their suffering whatsoever, and in fact, their end is often slow and painful, and not in the least their fault for what they're living through. People who are born into war contexts, young children, people emerging into their teens, this is their thrown-ness, and they can try as much as they wish, but some of the finest, because the time they're born into, one of the great poets, William Owen, key figure in terms of poetry in Canada, World War One, dies dies as a result of fighting in the war. In one of his poems, is it for this the clay grew tall? Was it for this the clay grew tall? Happened to be born in a period of time. He follows the state into war. He dies. Was it a tragic flaw? No. Born into a period of time of history that war was front and center. Not all people are thrown into that period of history. And so the tragic position, and this is where when we come back to human rights again, we can think as much as we like about human rights. We can put legal documents in place. We can have states that are responsible for enshrining those documents and upholding them. We can have non-government, government-assisted groups that are responsible for that. But then there's also the real human condition in which both humanity, in terms of its clashing with one another, leads to horrendous implications, which are not the result of tragic flaws, but in fact often humans turning on one another and innocent people being the victim or being caught up in the whirligig in that sense. And then there's also nature itself and people being thrown into context in which certain parts of the world geographically, in which there are famines and floods, in which there are elements also which humans have created aspects of that, but long before humans and global warming, there were these situations in which people are born into, which do not always lead to a happy ending, regardless of how hard they try to bring about the best in terms of their journey and ensuring and guaranteeing rights. So there's this tragic element as well in life. Now, the comedic approach always and ever again tries to overcome the tragic dimension, but the tragic dimension ever lingers on. And part of the human rights journey is an attempt to, as much and as far as possible, bring about the comedic ending while recognizing that the tragic is always looking at the balcony and peering over about what humans are trying to do within the streets and time of the cities and states that they live in. And so when we think human rights, we always have to recognize there is this tragic comedic tension, which is a part of the journey, which doesn't mean one gives up because of the tragic. It just means that not just because a person is committed to grappling with issues does not mean the outcome will always be comedic in that sense. The Walt Disney ending, the Lord of the Rings ending, the Harry Potter ending, the Walt Disney endings to most of the films. In fact, there is always going to be this surd or this ambiguous, this uncertainty, and the human tendency is always, particularly in an affluent tradition, to think with effort, with planning, puzzle mind can sort things out and bring a happy ending, but that simply ignores both the complex nature of humans in society, nature in humanity, and the implications of not understanding that can lead to a naive view of what people can do with rights. The flip side of that, of course, is to argue if one does not buy into the comedic idealistic view of human rights, is to slip into the tragic, what's called the realistic view of human rights, that this is humans' lot, that no matter what we do, like Sisyphus, we will never get to the mountain top. And so the tragic elements And so the great Spanish philosopher Unamuno did his fine work, The Tragic Sense of Life. And there's been quite a movement today also to deal with and rightly so, with the element of the tragic, which has a long history in terms of thoughtful people in the Occident and the Orient reflecting on that. And so when we look at the tragic, that often fits nicely into a realistic and sometimes a power politics view of human rights. We think of the comedic, that's the idealistic view in which we can, through our efforts, create a better world. But I think anyone who's lived much in history, and certainly in the 20th and early years of the 21st century, knows that these great perennial themes of the idealist, the comedic, and the tragic and the realistic will continue to wage a struggle, and to end with a saying from Italy, la lotta continua, the battle goes ever on.